The voicemail I found waiting for me said, "Honey, your crazy daughter won't let us in. We're stuck on the stairs with our stuff." My stepmother thought she could barge into my late father's apartment and claim it as her own. She believed her manipulation and screaming would force me to cave in. What she didn't know was that I held the one piece of paper that would bring her downfall crashing down in front of everyone. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. The first time I listened to that voicemail, I actually laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. Not the kind that comes from genuine amusement. It was sharp, bitter. The kind of laugh that bursts out when you can't believe the audacity of someone's words. "Honey, your crazy daughter won't let us in. We're stuck on the stairs with our stuff." The tone of her voice, half whining, half accusatory, was burned into my ears. She had called my mother, of all people, to complain about me, as though painting me as the crazy daughter would somehow shame me into opening the door and surrendering the one thing in this world that still made me feel close to my father. I remember standing in the narrow entryway of the apartment, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the door as if her voice might somehow seep through the wood. Beyond the door, I knew she and her son were waiting. I pictured them standing in the stairwell, bags piled around them, glaring at my closed door, convinced they could bully their way into my life. At that moment, I wasn't scared. I wasn't even angry yet. What I felt was a weary sense of recognition. I had known this day was coming. My stepmother had always circled like a vulture, eyeing my father's possessions as though they were prizes waiting to be handed to her. And now, with my father gone, she had decided it was time to swoop in. The voicemail was just the spark, the ridiculous, entitled opening line to what would become one of the most exhausting, yet strangely satisfying chapters of my life. You see, that apartment wasn't just for walls and a roof. It was my father's place. His handwriting still labeled the kitchen jars. His old armchair sat by the window where the morning sun spilled in. The smell of his aftershave lingered faintly in the closet even months after he passed. It was where we had shared quiet dinners and long conversations, the place I came to feel less alone in my grief. And here she was calling me crazy, accusing me of keeping her out, as if she had any claim to this sanctuary. The words on that voicemail set the tone for everything that followed. Her arrogance, her manipulation, her unshakable belief that if she shouted loudly enough, she would get her way. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's this: people who rely on noise and drama rarely expect someone else to stand firm in silence. So as her voice echoed in my head, I leaned against the door, took a deep breath, and made a quiet vow to myself. She was not getting in. Not through screaming, not through guilt-tripping, and certainly not through some pitiful performance on my mother's voicemail. This was my home now, and I was prepared to fight for it, no matter how long it took. Little did she know, she had already lost before she even dragged those suitcases up the stairs. After I played that voicemail a second time, I set my phone down on the counter and just stood there in the quiet of the apartment. The silence was almost heavy, wrapping around me like a blanket. And in that silence, I thought about how strange life had become since my father passed. When he was alive, everything felt steady. He wasn't a dramatic man, far from it. He believed in order, in decency, in working hard for what you wanted. His apartment was an extension of him. Tidy, modest, but full of warmth. He loved his books, his little balcony garden, and his nightly routine of brewing tea before bed. When I inherited the place after he died, it felt like a small anchor in the storm of grief. I was in my 30s, trying to balance work and my own quiet life, and losing him had left a hole I wasn't sure could ever be filled. But being here, in these walls where his presence still lingered, gave me some comfort. It made the loss feel a little less final. That was my normal world in those months after his passing. I would come home from work, slip off my shoes at the door like he always did, and let the familiar creak of the floorboards remind me I wasn't completely adrift. But there was a shadow over that peace, and that shadow had a name: my stepmother. I won't deny it. When my father first remarried, I tried to give her a fair chance. She was polite enough in public, all smiles and soft words. But I quickly learned that underneath that mask was a woman who believed life owed her comfort. She didn't work. She didn't cook. She didn't clean. What she did was demand, and she was clever about it. She never came right out and asked my father for things in front of me. Instead, she'd hint at how other women don't have to worry about bills or how a bigger place would be more suitable. My father, bless him, saw through most of it. He loved her in his own way, but he wasn't blind to her flaws. Still, she had one tactic that always worked on him: the dramatics. If she didn't get what she wanted, she'd cry. Loud, sobbing tears that made my father sigh, rub his temples, and eventually give in to some small request just to keep the peace. Then there was her son, my so-called stepbrother, though I never called him that. He was in his mid-20s but acted like a boy half his age. He drifted from job to job, living off his mother's excuses and other people's generosity. He had a way of slouching into a room like he owned it, all bravado and arrogance, even though he had accomplished nothing. When my father was alive, he tolerated the young man but never indulged him. He'd say, a man should make his own way, not ride on the coattails of others. But the boy never listened. Why should he? His mother always found a way to bail him out, smooth things over, or shift the blame. After my father's passing, the two of them became more present in my life than I ever wanted. At first, it was subtle. My stepmother would call me with a sympathetic voice, asking how I was holding up, but then slip in comments like, "It must be lonely in that big apartment all by yourself." Other times, she'd suggest her son could help me out around the place, as if I needed his lazy presence lounging on my couch. I knew what she was doing. She was testing the waters, dropping hints, hoping I'd open the door just a crack. But I kept my answers polite and short. I wasn't interested in entertaining her schemes. Still, I could feel her circling, like a storm building on the horizon. Her calls and visits grew more frequent, more insistent. Every time I refused her, her mask of sweetness slipped just a little further. Looking back, I realized the signs were all there. The pointed questions about my schedule, the way her son started hanging around the building under flimsy pretenses, even the neighbors mentioning they'd seen her snooping around the lobby. My normal world after Dad's passing wasn't entirely peaceful. It was more like fragile peace, waiting to be shattered, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before she stopped hinting and decided to make her move. It happened on a Thursday evening, one of those ordinary days where I came home tired, but content to slip back into the quiet of my father's apartment. I remember juggling a bag of groceries, already thinking about the soup I planned to make, when I heard the noise. At first, I thought someone else in the building was moving in. There was the unmistakable scrape of luggage wheels against the concrete stairwell, the dull thud of heavy bags hitting each step. But as I rounded the corner and saw who it was, my heart sank. There they were, My stepmother, in her flashy coat and heels far too high for the stairs, huffing dramatically as though the climb were some personal assault against her, and her son, trailing behind with the overstuffed duffel bags slung over his shoulders, looking smug, like he was about to drop anchor in his new kingdom. Finally, she said when she spotted me, brushing a strand of hair from her face with an air of relief, as though I'd been keeping them waiting on purpose. You can open up now. We're exhausted. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. Open up now? She gestured toward the bags stacked against the railing. We've brought our things. No point wasting time, we'll settle in tonight. I tightened my grip on the grocery bag. Excuse me? My voice came out quieter than I expected, but steady. Her son chuckled under his breath, as though the situation were already decided. Mom said this was ours too. Dad wouldn't want you hogging it all to yourself. He gave the words a cruel twist, spitting out the word dad as if the man had been his father. Not mine. My stepmother tilted her chin, eyes gleaming with false pity. Sweetheart, don't make this harder than it has to be. You know I was your father's wife. I have every right to this apartment. And of course, my son will be living with me. It's only fair. Her tone smooth, calculated, was the same one she used to wear my father down. But I wasn't my father, and this wasn't going to work on me. I took a slow breath. This apartment belongs to me. You know that. Her smile faltered, just for a second, then snapped back into place. Don't be ridiculous. We're family. What are people going to think if you kick us out onto the street? Do you want to be the kind of daughter who leaves her stepmother stranded? That was when the first flicker of anger sparked inside me, because she knew very well she wasn't stranded. She still had her own place, smaller. Yes, less glamorous than she liked, but perfectly livable. This wasn't about need. This was about greed. I shifted the groceries to my other hand and moved past them toward the door. You're not moving in. Her son scoffed. You don't get to decide that. I stopped with my key halfway into the lock and turned to face them fully. My stepmother's cheeks were flushed, not with embarrassment but with frustration. She wasn't used to being told no. Yes, I said quietly, firmly. I do. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the stairwell light. For a split second, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe she'd see that I wasn't budging. But then her expression hardened. The sweetness dropped from her voice like a mask hitting the floor. Fine, she hissed. If you want to play that way, then you'll see how crazy you look. Don't come crying to us when everyone realizes what kind of daughter you really are. And with that, she pulled out her phone, turned her back to me, and started dialing. A moment later, her shrill voice echoed through the stairwell, leaving that now infamous voicemail on my mother's phone. Honey, your crazy daughter won't let us in. We're stuck on the stairs with our stuff. It was the moment the line was crossed. No more hints. No more subtle manipulations. She had made her move, and I knew, standing there with my groceries and my patience fraying, that this was only the beginning. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it firmly behind me. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was from the certainty that a storm had just broken over my quiet life, and I would have to fight to protect what was mine. The days that followed felt like a siege. I had naively hoped that after I stood my ground, after I refused to let them cross the threshold, they would retreat and lick their wounds somewhere else. But I should have known better. People like my stepmother don't retreat. They regroup. They come back louder, more insistent, more shameless than before. The first morning after the stairwell confrontation, I was woken not by my alarm clock but by the pounding of fists against my door. The banging rattled through the apartment, sharp and relentless, accompanied by her voice rising like a siren. Open this door right now. You can't keep us out forever. This is our home too. I stayed perfectly still in bed, staring at the ceiling. My heart thudded, but I forced myself not to move, not to respond. If I gave her the satisfaction of a reaction, she'd only escalate further. Eventually, the pounding stopped, replaced by muffled voices and the shuffle of feet retreating down the stairs. I thought that might be the end of it, but less than 2 hours later, they were back. This time, it wasn't just shouting. They had started talking to the neighbors. When I left for work that day, one of the elderly ladies who lived down the hall gave me a look I didn't recognize, part suspicion, part pity. I paused, and she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Your stepmother said you locked her out. Is that true? I swallowed back a bitter laugh. Locked her out. The phrasing was deliberate, painting me as cruel, unstable, unkind. I explained as gently as I could, but I could see the seeds of doubt had already been planted. That was her tactic: control the narrative before I even had a chance to speak. The harassment didn't stop there. Notes began appearing under my door. Crumpled sheets of paper, sometimes handwritten in her sharp, spidery script, other times in her son's sloppy scrawl. You're making a fool of yourself. We have legal rights, you know. Dad wouldn't want you treating us like this. The worst one read simply, you can't keep us out forever. I kept them all, sliding them into a folder. At first, it was instinct, a way to keep track of their harassment. But soon, I realized it was also evidence. Proof that this wasn't just a family dispute but a campaign of intimidation. One evening, as I carried groceries back up the stairs, her son appeared halfway down the hall. He leaned casually against the wall, arms folded, wearing that same smirk he'd worn the day they tried to move in. You know, he drawled, it's only a matter of time before this place is ours. You could make it easier on yourself and just hand over the keys now. I stopped 3 steps below him, adjusting the grocery bag on my hip. This apartment doesn't belong to you. It never will. His smirk widened, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. We'll see about that. I pushed past him, refusing to give him more than that. But the encounter left my hands trembling long after I locked the door behind me. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a threat. They escalated further by spreading rumors throughout the building. I overheard to neighbors whispering in the lobby about how I was unstable and keeping family out on the street. It stung, hearing my reputation twisted into a caricature of cruelty. But I clenched my jaw and walked past without a word. That was their strategy. Pressure me from every angle until I cracked. They thought they could isolate me, make me doubt myself, make me feel ashamed. But instead of breaking me down, each knock, each note, each whisper in the hallway only strengthened my resolve. I started to feel like a soldier guarding a fortress. Every time I turned the key in the lock, every time I ignored their shouting through the door, I was defending not just for walls but my father's legacy. This wasn't about stubbornness or pride. This was about protecting what he had entrusted to me. Still, I could sense the tension building, winding tighter with each encounter. I knew in my gut they weren't finished, not by a long shot. And I was right. Because the day came when they didn't just knock, or shout, or slip notes. The day came when they physically blocked me, barricading the stairwell with their suitcases and daring me to try and push past. That was the moment everything shifted. That was when their petty games crossed into something far more dangerous. And that was when I realized I couldn't simply wait them out anymore. It was late in the evening when it finally happened. I had stayed late at work, finishing a report that drained me of the last of my energy. All I wanted was to come home, change into comfortable clothes, and curl up with a book. But as I climbed the stairwell, I froze. The narrow passageway leading up to my apartment was blocked. Suitcases, 4 of them, lined the steps like barricades. Boxes were stacked precariously against the railing. A blanket had even been draped across the landing, as though they were trying to fashion a makeshift curtain, marking their territory. And there they were. My stepmother sat perched on one of the suitcases, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line of false patience. Her son lounged on the steps above her, scrolling on his phone as though he were already at home. The sight stopped me cold. My hand tightened on the railing until my knuckles went white. For a few seconds, I simply stared, too stunned to speak. She noticed me first. "Well, there you are," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We were beginning to think you'd never show up. We've been waiting all evening." I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain calm. "What are you doing?" Her son didn't even look up from his phone. "Moving in, like we said." I shook my head, my pulse pounding. "No, you're not." That's when she launched into her performance. She clutched at her chest, her eyes glistening with the faintest hint of crocodile tears. "Do you hear her?" she cried, turning as though to some invisible jury. "She's shutting out her own family, leaving us on the stairs with nowhere to go. What kind of daughter does that?" My voice caught in my throat, anger and disbelief tangling inside me. "You have a home, both of you. You're not stranded. You're here because you chose to be." She dropped the pretense then, her expression sharpening like a knife. "Enough. Either you let us in right now, or we'll call the police. We'll tell them you've locked us out of our rightful home." Her words echoed in the stairwell, cold and deliberate. My stomach dropped. That was her endgame all along, to twist the story until I was the villain, until someone in authority would force my hand. For the first time since this ordeal began, fear pressed in on me. What if the police believed her? What if the neighbors backed up her lies? She had already poisoned them against me with whispers and rumors. But then another feeling surged up, burning hotter than fear. Fury. A slow, steady fire that burned away my hesitation. I looked at the suitcases, at the smug tilt of her son's head, at the way she squared her shoulders as though victory were inevitable. And something inside me hardened. This was it. This was the final straw. I had been patient. I had been quiet. I had tolerated their pounding, their lies, their notes shoved under my door. But now they were physically blocking me from entering my own home, daring me to yield no more. I set my bag down on the step, straightened my back, and met her gaze head on. My voice was low, steady, every word laced with steel. "Call whoever you want, but I promise you this: you will regret it." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. Just a flicker, quickly masked, but enough to let me know she wasn't as confident as she pretended. I stepped carefully over one of the smaller boxes, unlocked my door, and closed it behind me with deliberate calm. Inside, my chest heaved with silent rage. That was the night I realized I could no longer just defend myself. It was time to go on the offensive. When I closed the door that night, I leaned against it, feeling the cool wood at my back as if it were the only thing holding me up. My hands were trembling not from fear anymore, but from the sheer force of my anger. I stood there in the dim light of the hallway, listening to their muffled voices through the door. My stepmother was still posturing, her son still laughing, dragging out their little performance as if persistence alone would wear me down. But something shifted inside me in that moment. I realized I couldn't just react to them anymore. I couldn't wait for the next knock, the next note, the next ambush on the stairs. They were playing offense, and I was stuck defending. That had to change. I needed something they couldn't twist or spin. Something undeniable. I pushed away from the door and went straight to the small cabinet in the corner of the living room. The one that still held my father's paperwork. I had avoided that drawer for months, unable to face the neat stacks of manila folders and envelopes with his careful handwriting. But tonight, my hands pulled the drawer open with purpose. Inside, among tax returns and old utility bills, was a thick, sealed folder with a notary stamp. My heart gave a small, sharp kick. The will. I pulled it out, sat down at the table, and spread the pages in front of me. The smell of old paper rose up, tinged faintly with the scent of my father's aftershave that clung to everything he touched. I ran my fingers along the neat black ink, the signatures, the official seals, and there it was, in clear, unambiguous language. The apartment, the furniture, the savings account, all of it left solely to me. My stepmother's name wasn't even on the list. I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening as I reached the section I had almost forgotten about. Years earlier, long before my father's illness, she had signed a separate agreement, a waiver in exchange for a generous payout. She had accepted a substantial sum of money from my father to relinquish any future claim on his estate. The notary's stamp, the signatures, the witnesses, all there in black and white. I sat back in my chair, staring at the papers spread before me. The weight of what I held in my hands pressed down on me, not just legal proof, but a shield, a weapon. All this time, she had tried to bully me with noise, with lies, with manipulation. But she had overlooked one crucial truth. She had already sold away her rights, and she knew it. The irony made me laugh, softly at first, then louder until the sound echoed strangely in the quiet apartment. She had taken my father's money years ago, probably thinking she was clever, thinking she had secured her comfort without consequence. And now that very choice was going to be the rope she hung herself with. I carefully slid the documents back into the folder and placed it in my bag. From now on, I would carry it with me everywhere. Let her pound on the door. Let her call the police. Let her shout to the neighbors. The moment it came to a head, I would be ready. And it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about making sure her downfall was as public and undeniable as the humiliation she had tried to heap on me. I went to bed that night with a strange calm settling over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't bracing for the next attack. I was planning my counterstrike, because now I held the one thing she could never scream over, never twist into a lie. The truth, stamped and sealed, and when the moment came, I would wield it like a sword. I slept differently that night, not the exhausted, fitful kind that comes from worry, but a clear, focused rest. For the first time since this began, I felt like someone with a plan. The folder with my father's will sat on the kitchen table where I could see it the next morning, like a promise waiting to be kept. When they returned, they were louder than usual. I heard them before I saw them. The clack of heels on the concrete, the hollow-sounding thump of soft-sided suitcases, the low, practiced hum of a woman on a mission. My stepmother's voice carried up the stairs, theatrical and polished, designed to recruit anyone who might be within earshot. "You can't treat family like this," she called. "We were evicted from our home. Come out and do the right thing." I put on a kettle, listened to it click and whistle, then turned it off. Small domestic rituals steadied me. I moved through the apartment with deliberate slowness, folding a tea towel, straightening a stack of mugs. Ordinary actions in an ordinary kitchen. They grounded me. Then I slid the folder into a slim bag and picked up my phone. I didn't call at first. I waited until I could hear them arranging themselves in the stairwell. Their footsteps and low voices a chaotic chorus. That was the moment I wanted. Witnesses in the building, the performance playing out in public. I wasn't looking for a quiet victory. I wanted a truth that couldn't be shouted down. I stepped out into the hall, bag on my shoulder, and opened the door. They were on the steps, exactly as I expected. Suitcases piled, faces set in indignation. The son lounged as though he hadn't a care in the world. My stepmother straightened when she saw me, and, without missing a beat, turned to the nearest neighbor as if she'd rehearsed this line a dozen times. "See?" she trilled. "She won't even let us into Dad's home. Isn't that awful?" A few heads peeked from upstairs windows, and a neighbor shuffled closer in obvious curiosity. The stage was set. I raised my chin and took a breath. My voice was calm. "If you want to make a formal complaint, go ahead," I said. "But before you call anyone, you should know one thing. My father left this apartment to me. He signed a will, and he left it to me. He also legally released my stepmother from any claim years ago. I have the documents right here." Her son barked a laugh, the kind that tries to hide the suddenness of unease. "You're lying. No one signs away their rights like that." "You'd be surprised," I said. "But you don't have to take my word for it." I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder, and walked down the stairs to where they had gathered. The neighbors watched. My heart beat a steady rhythm, not from fear this time, but from a strange, steady anticipation. I opened the folder, spread the documents on the top of one suitcase like an exhibit, and turned to the relevant pages. The paper felt heavier than it looked. Not just because of the ink and stamps, but because of what it represented. Every quiet conversation my father and I had had about his wishes. The careful planning he'd done to make sure his affairs were in order. I pointed to the clause that mattered, reading it aloud in a voice that didn't tremble. "This document is my father's signed will," I said. "It clearly states that the apartment and all its contents are bequeathed to me. Furthermore, this agreement here, signed and notarized, shows that my stepmother accepted a settlement some years ago and waived any claim to the estate." A hush spread. The neighbors shifted, eyes flicking between the papers and my stepmother's face. The color drained from hers as she realized this wasn't a casual threat anymore. This was documented fact. She tried to recover quickly. "Those papers, they could be forged," she said, the old performative hysteria creeping back in. "You never know. Legal things can be tricky." That was when I did what I had been planning. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police number. I wasn't calling to file a petty complaint. I wanted an official record, an impartial presence who would read the paperwork and speak plainly. "Hello, this is First Precinct," the operator said. "How can we help?" "I need an officer to my building," I said. "There's an ongoing trespass and harassment situation. I have legal documents proving ownership of my property. Neighbors are present as witnesses." I didn't plead or explain beyond that. The woman on the line confirmed a patrol would be dispatched and gave me an estimated time. I told her to come when available and then placed the phone back in my pocket. I met my stepmother's eyes. "I've called the police," I said. "They'll be here soon." Her face contorted with rage and panic in a way I'd never seen before. She started to sputter, and the son's smugness began to crack. For the first time, their cool performance showed its seams. When the officers arrived, two of them in uniform, professional and quiet, The stairwell felt suddenly like a courtroom. They introduced themselves, asked for a brief statement from each side, and listened without interruption. I handed the folder to the lead officer, who paged through the documents with careful attention. He read the will, took note of the signatures, and then stopped at the waiver. He asked a few procedural questions about notarization and witnesses, questions that made the legality undeniable to any layperson listening. "You received a settlement?" he asked my stepmother, his voice even. She hesitated, then muttered, "It was a long time ago." "Was it signed in your presence?" he asked, looking directly at her. She faltered, "Yes, I think so." The officer didn't raise his voice. He simply explained the law in plain terms. When someone signs a notarized waiver, and a will clearly bequeaths property, the right of ownership rests with the named beneficiary. Trespass and harassment complaints can be filed if individuals remain on private property without consent. He looked up from the papers and addressed my stepmother directly. "Ma'am, these documents show that this apartment belongs to her. If you continue to remain here or return and try to enter, you could be charged with trespassing." There it was, the sentence I had been waiting to hear. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but exact and firm. Her shoulders sagged, the mask slipping into something raw and vulnerable. For a brief flash, I saw not the polished antagonist but a woman faced with consequences she had once thought she could buy her way out of. She opened her mouth, tried to protest, tried to spin another story, but the combination of the paperwork and the officer's quiet authority closed the space for lies. Her son, who had been ready to argue, sat on his suitcase and stared at his hands. The neighbors looked at them with something like pity and, in some cases, the faintest hint of disdain. The officer made a note in his report and informed them of their options: leave peacefully, or risk being removed and charged. They packed up their suitcases with slow, humiliating movements. I watched every gesture, cataloging their expressions, storing the image of their retreat in my mind like proof that justice, measured and uncomplicated, had been served. As they descended the stairs, heads bowed. My stepmother turned one last time and spat a bitter, "You'll regret this," before hurrying away. But her words landed hollow. No one followed her out in sympathy. The neighbors watched her go, the weight of truth settling into the hallway like dust. The officers stayed long enough to take a formal statement and reassure me that they'd mark the incident in their records. They told me what steps I could take if she tried to return, how to request a restraining order or press trespass charges. Their presence made the situation official in a way nothing else could. When the door finally closed behind the last of their luggage, the apartment felt impossibly quiet. I stood in the entryway for a long time, the folder in my hand, and let the reality of what had just happened sink in. I felt a tangle of emotions: relief, exhaustion, a deep, soft sorrow for the man my father had married and for the way greed had hollowed him out. But above all, a steady, clear gratitude. I had not screamed. I had not raised my voice. I had not stooped to the theatrics that had been their currency. Instead, I had done the thing that mattered. I'd let the truth, the documented reality of my father's wishes, speak for itself. That night, when I sat in my father's armchair with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, the apartment felt like home again. The battle had been ugly, yes, but the consequence had been exactly fitting. Not a dramatic downfall or a public shaming orchestrated by me, but the quiet, undeniable result of facts meeting law. Their plan had collapsed under the weight of its own falsehoods. The kettle clicked softly in the background. I breathed in the smell of old paper and tea and the faint lingering trace of my father's aftershave. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind me. Asterisk if the climax was the moment the officers confirmed the truth. Then the downfall was everything that came after. The unraveling, the stripping away of their bluster, the collapse of their confidence in front of the very audience they had tried so hard to manipulate. My stepmother had always thrived on appearances. She dressed for attention, spoke for effect, and spun her stories to win sympathy. She expected people to take her side simply because she was louder, flashier, more theatrical. And for a while, it had worked. Neighbors had raised their eyebrows at me. Whispers had curled through the hallways. Even I had begun to worry that if the police ever came, her noise might drown out my truth. But that night, standing in the stairwell, the script flipped. She started strong, her voice shrill as she tried to outtalk the officers. "This is a mistake. She's lying. My husband would never." The officer cut her off with the patience of someone used to theatrics. "Ma'am, I've read the will. Your signature is right here on the waiver. Do you deny this is yours?" For a fraction of a second, silence fell. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The denial she had prepared died on her tongue, because even she knew how ridiculous it would sound. If she denied her own signature, she'd be calling into question a notarized document. Her son shifted uncomfortably on the step, muttering something about technicalities. But the officer's gaze fixed on him like a spotlight. "A legal waiver is not a technicality," he said firmly. "It's binding." The smug expression that boy had worn every time he leaned against the hallway wall, every time he told me "we'll see about that," melted into something small and uncertain. He slouched deeper, eyes darting anywhere but the papers. And then came the humiliation. Not from me, but from the truth itself. The officers instructed them to pack up their belongings and leave the building. It wasn't just the words. It was the finality in the tone, the authority that even they couldn't argue with. Every neighbor within earshot now knew. This wasn't me being crazy. This wasn't me being cruel. This was them, exposed for exactly what they were. Trespassers with no claim, no right, no power. As they started gathering their things, the stairwell echoed with the sounds of defeat. Zippers dragged shut. Suitcases scraped against the concrete. Her heels clicked unevenly as she tried to maintain her dignity. Her face set in an expression of brittle pride that fooled no one. At one point, she turned on me, eyes blazing. "You'll regret this," she spat. The words were sharp, meant to cut, but they fell flat. Not one neighbor rallied to her defense. Not one officer gave her threat weight. It was a hollow promise from someone who had already lost. Her son cursed under his breath as he fumbled with a box, nearly dropping it on the stairs. The arrogance he had worn like a second skin was gone, replaced with frustration and embarrassment. He refused to look at me, his jaw clenched tight, as though ignoring me might erase the shame. The most satisfying part wasn't their words, though. It was their faces. My stepmother, who had once smirked at me with that condescending air, now flushed red, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. Her son, who had leaned in close with that smug grin, now avoided every glance, shoulders hunched. And all around us, neighbors stood in their doorways or leaned on the railings, watching. The same people who had once whispered doubts now witnessed the truth laid bare. Their silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was heavy, judging, disappointed, and it wasn't aimed at me. By the time they reached the bottom of the stairs, dragging their bags behind them, the battle was over. The officers walked with them to ensure they left peacefully. But the real punishment was already done. They hadn't just been removed from the building. They had been stripped of the narrative they'd so carefully spun. The woman who had called me crazy was now the one exposed as irrational, greedy, and powerless. And there was no undoing that. As the door closed behind them, the sound reverberated through the stairwell like the final note of a gavel striking. The confrontation was over. The downfall was complete. There are moments in life that etch themselves into your memory. Moments that replay again and again because they carry the weight of justice. For me, that moment came just as the officers were wrapping up their report. Standing in the stairwell with the papers still in hand, one officer turned to my stepmother and, in a voice loud enough for every curious neighbor to hear, said, "Mum, this apartment has never belonged to you. You signed away your rights years ago. This property is hers, and hers alone." The words rang through the air, clear and undeniable. For weeks, she had painted me as unstable, selfish, cruel. She had called me crazy to anyone who would listen. But in that instant, with those few simple sentences, the truth demolished every lie she had told. And it wasn't me saying it. It was the law, spoken with authority by someone she couldn't talk over. I looked at her face as those words landed. Shock flickered first. Wide-eyed disbelief that someone had dared to strip away her illusion in front of an audience. Then came the denial, her lips parting as if she could argue, only for no sound to come. Finally, the rage, her jaw tightening, her nostrils flaring, her fists clenching at her sides. But none of it mattered anymore. Her son shifted uncomfortably beside her, his bravado gone. He muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse, but he didn't raise his voice. He couldn't. The weight of the officer's statement had crushed the last of his smugness. The neighbors who had been peeking from their doorways leaned in closer. One of them, the same woman who had once asked me if I'd really locked my poor stepmother out, shook her head with a quiet, almost pitying sigh. Another neighbor whispered, "So she was lying all along." That was the payoff. Not just that I had one. Not just that they had been forced to leave. But that everyone who had doubted me now saw the truth with their own eyes and ears. The lies collapsed, and their humiliation was public, undeniable, complete. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply stood there, calm, steady, watching as they dragged their suitcases down the last flight of stairs. The sound of those wheels scraping against the concrete steps was like music, a clumsy, graceless retreat. And when the door finally slammed shut behind them, the silence that followed was sweeter than any applause. I stepped back into the apartment, closing my door with deliberate calm. For the first time since this battle began, I felt the space settle around me like it belonged to me again. No more pounding fists. No more venomous notes. No more whispered doubts from neighbors. Just me, the quiet, and the lingering sense that justice had not only been served, but served perfectly, because in the end, their downfall wasn't just being told to leave. It was being forced to face the consequences of their own greed. My stepmother had traded away her claim for money years ago, and now that very decision had destroyed her chance to take more. Her son had mocked me, saying we'll see about that. And now everyone had seen exactly how wrong he was. The irony was flawless. The punishment fit the crime, and I didn't have to raise my voice, lose my composure, or play their games. All I had to do was stand firm and let the truth speak louder than their lies ever could. That was the moment I knew I had won. The days after their departure felt almost unreal. For weeks, my life had been dominated by the constant pounding on the door, the shouted accusations, the poisoned whispers in the hallways. Silence had become a luxury I didn't think I'd ever know again. But suddenly, The building was quiet, no more suitcases clattering on the stairs. No more notes slid under my door. No more neighbors looking at me with suspicion in their eyes. At first, I didn't quite trust it. I'd pause before opening the door, half expecting to see them lurking in the hallway. But each time, the space outside was empty. Just the creak of old steps, the faint hum of pipes, and nothing else. Slowly, I let myself believe that it was over. They never came back. Not once. The officers had made it clear. If they returned, if they tried again to harass me, they would face trespassing charges. My stepmother was many things. Manipulative, entitled, relentless. But she wasn't foolish enough to risk a criminal record. And her son, for all his arrogance, clearly had no appetite for legal trouble either. What surprised me most wasn't their absence but the shift in my neighbors. The same people who had once whispered behind my back now went out of their way to greet me. One morning, as I checked my mailbox, the older woman who had asked me if I'd really locked them out stopped me. She placed a hand on my arm and said quietly, "I'm sorry. I should have known better." Her words softened something in me. I hadn't realized how deeply their doubt had cut until I felt the balm of their apology. Another neighbor, a young father from 2 doors down, caught me in the hallway a few days later. "We saw everything," he said. "We saw how you handled it. You didn't yell. You didn't cause a scene. You just stood your ground. Good for you." Those words stayed with me. Because he was right. I hadn't needed to fight fire with fire. I had protected what was mine with dignity, and in the end, the truth had done the rest. Inside the apartment, life slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. I went back to cooking in the evenings, watering the little plants my father had kept on the balcony, sitting in his old armchair with a book in hand. The apartment no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like home again. But I had changed. Something about standing up to them, about refusing to be bullied out of what was rightfully mine, had settled deep inside me. I felt stronger, steadier. I carried myself differently, no longer bracing for the next ambush. I often thought about my father during those quiet evenings. I imagined what he would have said, how he would have shaken his head at their shamelessness. How proud he would have been that I held firm. And I realized that in protecting the apartment, I hadn't just defended four walls. I had defended his memory, his legacy, his trust in me. As for my stepmother and her son, word spread quickly that they had been thrown out. The humiliation followed them like a shadow. People who once entertained their dramatics now saw through them. They faded into the background, smaller, less formidable, stripped of the image they had once cultivated. That was their true punishment. Not just losing the apartment, but losing face, losing credibility, being remembered not as victims of a crazy daughter, but as greedy opportunists who had been caught and put in their place. In the end, the balance had been restored. The moral was simple, and it echoed in my mind every time I walked through the apartment door. Greed blinds people. It makes them reckless, arrogant, convinced they can twist reality to fit their desires. But the truth has a way of outlasting lies. It waits patiently, quietly, until the moment comes to reveal itself. And when it does, justice doesn't just prevail, it prevails perfectly. That apartment, my father's apartment, is still mine. It always will be. And every time I turn the key in the lock, I'm reminded not just of the man who left it to me, but of the lesson that came with it. Some battles aren't won with shouting or force. They're won with patience, with clarity, with the strength to stand firm while the storm rages, and the wisdom to let the storm destroy itself. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.